Welcome to Hidden Chapters. Not every decision is recorded. But every decision leaves a mark. This is one of them. His name wasn't in the system. No record. No history. No clearance level. That's when I realized this wasn't an oversight. It was intentional. The order came in the same way most of them do. Quietly. Digitally. Without explanation. One detainee. One escort detail. One destination listed as temporary holding. Nothing urgent. Nothing unusual. The kind of transfer that exists only to move responsibility from one desk to another. I skimmed the file once. Then again. Then a third time, slower. The name field was blank. Not redacted. Not classified. Just empty. No aliases. No previous detentions. No biometric reference. Even the internal tracking number resolved to nothing when I tried to expand it. That doesn't happen. In a system like ours, everyone exists somewhere. Enemy combatants, civilians, contractors, even mistakes, they all leave traces. Data doesn't disappear unless someone with authority decides it shouldn't be found. I checked the timestamp. The file had been created less than an hour earlier. Clean. Too clean. Is this correct? I asked over the secure line. Yes, came the reply. Neutral. Uninterested. Proceed as instructed. That was the first warning. When people don't defend an anomaly, it's because they're not allowed to acknowledge it. I requested supplemental documentation. Medical clearance. Chain of custody confirmation. Anything that would force the system to populate missing fields. Every request was approved. Every attachment was empty. The man was being moved through infrastructure designed for people who don't officially exist. I found him in a holding room near the edge of the compound. No restraints. No agitation. He sat upright on the bench, hands folded, eyes steady. He looked older than the age listed on the temporary form, which itself looked like it had been generated just to satisfy procedure. He looked at me before I spoke. Not nervously. Not expectantly. Like he already knew the shape of what was happening. Am I on the list yet? He asked. I didn't answer. That was the second warning. People don't ask that question unless they understand how the system works, or how it can be used. I checked his wristband. No ID code. Just a blank strip of plastic with a timestamp. Stand up, I said. He complied immediately. As we walked, I noticed something else. No guards watching us. No observers. Cameras active, but not recording to the usual servers. The transfer corridor felt isolated. Intentionally removed from the normal flow. This wasn't about moving a detainee. It was about moving something without witnesses. As we reached the vehicle, I caught a reflection in the window, my own face, framed by a decision I hadn't agreed to yet. I understood then that the danger wasn't the man beside me. It was the absence surrounding him. Because when someone isn't on the list, it's not always because they were erased. Sometimes it's because they were never meant to be recorded at all. And sometimes. That's part of the plan. The vehicle was already waiting. Engine running. Doors open. No markings beyond what was required to pass checkpoints without questions. The kind of transport designed to look forgettable the moment it left your line of sight. I guided him into the back and took the seat opposite. The door closed, sealing us into a narrow space filled with the low hum of machinery and the smell of recycled air. No restraints. No guards inside with us. That was the third warning. High-risk detainees don't travel like this. Neither do low-risk ones. This was something else entirely, a controlled absence moving through a controlled environment. As we pulled away, I watched the compound recede through the rear window. Gates opened automatically. No IDs scanned. No confirmations requested. The system was treating this transfer as already completed. "You don't look surprised," I said. He met my eyes without hesitation. "Surprise requires uncertainty." That answer stayed with me longer than it should have. I activated the onboard terminal and tried once more to pull his profile. Same result. Blank fields. Empty references. Even the audit trail led nowhere, as if the file had been created and approved in the same breath. "Where are we going?" I asked. He considered the question carefully. "To where the paperwork ends." That wasn't evasive. It was precise. We hit the first checkpoint 20 minutes later. Routine inspection. Visual confirmation only. The guard glanced inside, saw 2 men sitting calmly, and waved us through. No questions. No verification. I logged the pass manually, more out of habit than necessity. The system accepted it without comment. As the road stretched out ahead of us, I began to notice the pattern. Each checkpoint was farther apart. Each handoff lighter than the last. Layers peeling away instead of stacking. Whoever planned this didn't want speed. They wanted deniability. "You planned this," I said quietly, not looking at him. "Yes," he replied. No hesitation. No pride. Just acknowledgement. "Then why me?" I asked. The vehicle slowed slightly as we entered a narrower road, flanked by empty land on both sides. "Because you notice when things don't add up," he said. "And because you don't panic when they don't." That was the 4th warning. I thought about turning the vehicle around. About forcing an alert. About breaking the silence that seemed to protect him. But I also understood something else. If this man was truly dangerous, he wouldn't be traveling this way. And if he wasn't dangerous, then someone had gone to extraordinary lengths to make him disappear without consequence. The road ahead dipped toward a stretch of terrain that didn't belong to any jurisdiction I recognized. The navigation system stopped updating, frozen at a boundary it refused to cross. I shut it off. Outside, the world felt thinner. Quieter. As if we'd slipped between pages instead of places. The man leaned back slightly. "This is where most people realize," he said, "that the order wasn't meant to be followed blindly." I kept my hand steady on my gear. "What happens if I stop this?" I asked. He didn't answer right away. "Then," he said finally, "you become the reason the list exists." The vehicle rolled on, carrying us deeper into a transfer that wasn't just about location. It was about deciding who would be left behind by the system. And who would quietly walk out of it. The road narrowed until it felt less like infrastructure and more like suggestion. Dust rose behind us in a steady cloud, blurring whatever had been willing to follow. The vehicle slowed without instruction, as if it understood that speed no longer mattered once we crossed a line no one monitored. I checked my watch. We were off schedule, not delayed, just unaccounted for. The kind of gap that only exists if someone planned for it. "Who cleared this route?" I asked. He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he looked past me, toward the sealed door, listening to the engine as if it were speaking to him. "No one," he said. "It clears itself." That wasn't arrogance. It was observation. I opened the terminal again, this time bypassing the navigation and pulling raw system logs. Time stamps continued. Fuel consumption updated. Location data simply stopped. The system knew we existed. It just didn't know where. That's when I realized the transfer wasn't moving him between facilities. It was moving him between categories. We passed an abandoned checkpoint, rusted barriers, signage faded beyond legibility. Once, this had been a border. Now it was just a reminder that authority expires when it isn't maintained. The driver didn't look back. He hadn't spoken since we left the compound. His role was mechanical, predefined, and intentionally limited. Another layer of deniability. "You're not escaping," I said. "This isn't that kind of movement." He smiled slightly. "Not relief. Recognition. Escaping implies pursuit," he said. "This is subtraction." I didn't like how easily he named it. We stopped near a cluster of structures that barely qualified as buildings. Concrete shells. Old antennas. A place that once mattered enough to be connected, and then didn't. The driver cut the engine and stepped out without waiting for instruction. No security detail arrived. No escort took over. The man across from me stood slowly. "This is where the list ends," he said. "And after?" I asked. "That depends on whether you believe lists protect people," he replied, "or protect systems." I followed him out. The air felt different here, thinner, like it carried less expectation. No cameras. No signals. Just a wide silence that wasn't accidental. He turned to face me fully for the first time. "You could stop this," he said. "Force the issue. Make noise." "Yes," I said. And then I disappeared differently," he replied. Messier. Louder. With consequences that ripple outward instead of inward. I considered the choice. Bring him back into a system that wanted him gone quietly. Or let him complete a plan designed to remove himself without friction. "Why go through all this?" I asked. "Because," he said, "some truths only survive if no one is responsible for them." He reached into his jacket slowly and produced a folded document. Not an ID. Not clearance. A ledger. Names. Dates. Operations I recognized, and others I didn't. This wasn't a man hiding from the system. This was someone stepping out of it. After making sure it could never claim ignorance again. I looked at the ledger, then back at him. In that moment, I understood the real risk. Not what he might do next. But what would happen if someone like him was ever officially acknowledged. And once you understand that, the gap stops being empty. It becomes a decision. The ledger felt heavier than it should have. Not because of its size, but because of what it represented, a record that existed only because someone had decided not to erase it. Names written carefully. Dates aligned too precisely to be coincidence. Operations that had been concluded without closure, resolved without explanation. I recognized enough to know it was real. "You planned this transfer," I said. "You planned the absence. But this," I gestured toward the ledger. "This doesn't vanish with you." "That's the point," he replied. "It survives without me." He didn't ask me to take it. He simply waited. Out here, there were no witnesses to shape the moment. No protocol to lean on. Just a quiet exchange between two people who understood what it meant to accept responsibility without authority. "Why trust me?" I asked. He smiled again, smaller this time. "Because you haven't asked who I am. Only why I'm not listed." That answer landed harder than anything he'd said so far. I slipped the ledger into my pack, sealing it where it wouldn't be damaged by dust or time. Once it was out of his hands, he seemed lighter, not relieved, but complete. From the far side of the compound, another vehicle approached. Different from ours. Civilian. Unmarked. It stopped at a distance that suggested familiarity without intimacy. The driver stepped out. No weapons visible. No urgency. Just a nod in our direction. "That's not official," I said. "It doesn't need to be," he replied. "It only needs to leave." He turned toward me fully now. "This is where your involvement ends." "Does it?" I asked. "Yes," he said. Anything beyond this point turns observation into ownership. The distinction mattered. If I followed him, I'd become part of the plan. If I stopped him, I'd validate the erasure he'd designed himself around. I stepped back. Not retreat. Not approval. Space. He walked toward the waiting vehicle without looking back. No final words. No gestures. Just movement, deliberate and irreversible. The driver opened the door. He climbed in. The engine started. Dust rose once more, swallowing the shape of the car as it pulled away. Within seconds, the place returned to stillness. I stood alone with the silence and the weight of what I'd accepted. The ledger wasn't a confession. It wasn't evidence. It was insurance. Against forgetting. Against revision. Against the comfort of ignorance. The original transport vehicle waited behind me, engine idling, systems already beginning to reconcile our absence as a clerical anomaly. I climbed back inside and closed the door. As we pulled away, I watched the structures fade into the distance, a place that had briefly mattered and now never would again. The man wasn't on the list because he never intended to be. He had used the system's need for order. To step outside of it. And now, whether I liked it or not, I was carrying the part of the plan that couldn't walk away on its own. That was the handoff. And it was done. The drive back felt longer, even though the distance hadn't changed. The vehicle moved smoothly, re-entering mapped roads without resistance. The navigation system came back online as if nothing unusual had happened, filling in gaps with confident certainty. Time stamps corrected themselves. Fuel usage normalized. The system did what it was designed to do. It pretended the gap never existed. I watched the numbers update and wondered how many times that had happened before. How often reality bent just enough for the record to stay straight. Transfer complete, the driver said, finally breaking his silence. Yes, I replied. And for the system, that was true. At the first checkpoint, a guard waved us through without looking inside. The second asked for documentation, glanced at the screen, and nodded. By the third, we were just another vehicle moving along a route that mattered to no one. I didn't report the handoff. I logged the transfer as finalized, destination confirmed, detainee released into custody that didn't require identification. The phrasing mattered. Words chosen carefully become facts once they're accepted. Back at the compound, routine swallowed us immediately. Radios crackled. Engines idled. People moved with purpose that didn't require explanation. I felt the ledger in my pack like a second pulse. That night, alone in my quarters, I opened it again. The entries weren't dramatic. No language of accusation. Just alignment. Dates. Locations. Outcomes that didn't match public records. Not crimes. Corrections. That was the unexpected part. The man hadn't been hiding wrongdoing. He'd been cataloging it, quietly, patiently, waiting for a moment when disappearance would protect the record instead of erase it. Someone had planned this with extraordinary care. Not to escape judgment. To delay it. I secured the ledger where it wouldn't be found casually. Not hidden. Just placed somewhere that required intent to access. The difference matters. The next morning, a brief came down from command. The transfer was marked as complete. No follow-up required. No further action anticipated. The list had closed itself. No one asked about the man. No one questioned the blank fields. The absence had been accepted as part of the process. That's when I understood the final layer of his plan. He hadn't just removed himself from the system. He'd tested it. And it had passed. Not because it was correct, but because it was comfortable. As the day went on, I noticed small shifts. A delay here. A clarification request there. Nothing obvious. Just enough to suggest someone, somewhere, was reconciling information they hadn't expected to still exist. The ledger was already doing its work. I hadn't changed anything yet. I didn't need to. Sometimes the most effective move is letting the system encounter a truth it can't erase, and watching how it responds. The man was gone. The list was closed. But the plan wasn't finished. It had just moved to the part that required patience. And patience, I'd learned, was where the real consequences lived. The ripple didn't start where I expected it to. Not at my level. Not in the reports. Not even in the systems that had quietly absorbed the transfer without complaint. It started farther out, where information moves slower and people have more time to notice when something doesn't align. A request came through 3 days later. Routine on the surface. A clarification inquiry tied to an operation listed in the ledger. No accusation. No urgency. Just a simple question that shouldn't have existed if the official version of events were complete. I read it twice. Someone had opened a door that wasn't meant to be visible. I didn't respond immediately. Timing matters. Respond too fast and you look eager. Too slow and you look evasive. I waited until the system nudged me again, then answered with precision, confirming nothing new, denying nothing old. The reply was accepted. But the question didn't disappear. Instead, it multiplied. Separate departments asked for small confirmations. Dates. Transit windows. Support roles. Each request harmless on its own. Together, they formed a pattern. Cross-checking. The ledger stayed closed. I hadn't shared it. Not directly. But its existence had already altered the flow of attention. Somewhere, someone had compared records and noticed the absence didn't match the explanation. That's how systems reveal themselves. Not by what they flag, but by what they quietly circle. I adjusted my routines. Changed where I logged in from. Varied timing. Made myself less predictable without becoming invisible. In logistics, invisibility raises suspicion. Consistency does not. At night, I thought about the man who'd walked away from the list. About how carefully he'd built the exit so it wouldn't collapse behind him. He hadn't needed allies. He'd needed witnesses. Not to his actions, but to the inconsistencies that followed. A week later, a briefing packet landed on my desk by mistake. Or design. It included references that shouldn't have been connected. Operations that shared personnel without sharing documentation. Outcomes that didn't align with inputs. Someone was assembling a picture. Not of him. Of the system he'd stepped out of. That's when I realized the unexpected turn wasn't his disappearance. It was that his absence created more visibility than his presence ever had. I closed the packet and forwarded it where it belonged, unchanged. No commentary. No emphasis. Just compliance. Compliance, in moments like this, is camouflage. The questions continued for another few days. Then they slowed. Then they stopped. Not because answers were found. Because conclusions were reached. I never received confirmation of what those conclusions were. I wasn't meant to. My role had ended the moment I accepted the ledger. Or so I thought. Late one evening, a message appeared on my terminal. No header. No sender. Just a single line of text. The record holds. That was all. I erased it and shut the system down. The ripple had reached its edge. What it would change, who it would expose, and when, those details no longer belonged to me. But I understood something now that I hadn't before. The most effective way to challenge a system isn't to confront it. It's to let it encounter a truth it can't fully erase, and step aside while it decides how to live with that. The man wasn't on the list. But his plan was working. And I was standing exactly where I was supposed to be when it did. After the questions stopped, the silence returned. Not the kind that comes from neglect, but the kind that settles after something has been adjusted. Like a system redistributing weight once it realizes a support beam isn't where it thought it was. I went back to routine. Schedules. Clearances. Transit windows. Everything moved the way it was supposed to, but the confidence was gone. Decisions took longer. Approvals required more eyes. People began to double-check things that used to pass without discussion. That's when you know something stuck. I didn't open the ledger again. There was no reason to. Its purpose wasn't to be referenced. It was to exist. A quiet constant in a structure that depended on forgetting. Weeks passed. I noticed reassignment orders circulating, temporary at first, then permanent. Personnel shuffled into roles that didn't quite fit. Oversight tightened where it had once been relaxed. Not aggressively. Carefully. No one said why. They never do. One afternoon, I was asked to review a transfer unrelated to mine. Different region. Different context. But the file paused on my screen a second longer than it should have. A name was present. So was a history. Too complete. I understood the message without it being stated. The system was correcting for absence by over-documenting presence. Making sure nothing else slipped through unrecorded. The list had changed, not in length, but in purpose. Later that day, I walked the perimeter of the compound alone. The fence line looked the same as it always had. Solid. Unremarkable. Necessary. I thought about how easily I could have chosen differently. How one report, one alert, one insistence on protocol would have collapsed the plan into something loud and irreversible. Nothing would have improved. It would have just moved the problem somewhere else. Instead, the balance had shifted quietly. No arrests. No exposure. No acknowledgements. Just adjustment. I received no further messages. No confirmation. No thanks. That was expected. Gratitude creates records, and records create responsibility. I didn't want either. The man had vanished into whatever life he'd prepared for himself. The ledger remained where it was, untouched, unspoken. And the system moved forward with a new awareness it would never admit to gaining. That was the cost. Not punishment. Attention. And attention, once applied, is difficult to remove. As the sun set that evening, I realized something else. I wasn't waiting for the other outcome anymore. I wasn't bracing for consequences or expecting retaliation. The story had already resolved itself in the only way it ever could. Quietly. The plan hadn't relied on me to act. It had relied on me to not interfere once the conditions were met. That's a harder role than people think. Doing nothing when it's the right nothing requires restraint most systems don't teach. I returned to my quarters and closed the door behind me. The ledger remained unseen. The list remained incomplete. And somewhere beyond the boundaries of the system, a man walked freely, not because he escaped judgment, but because he'd ensured that judgment could no longer be ignored. That was the balance. And for the first time since the order arrived, I slept without listening for the sound of something being erased. Cost doesn't always arrive as punishment. Sometimes it shows up as awareness, the kind that follows you quietly, changing how you read orders and how you hear silence. After the balance settled, that awareness stayed with me. Work continued, but it felt different now. Less automatic. Less insulated. Every request carried an unspoken second layer, why this, why now? The system hadn't become hostile. It had become cautious. Caution is expensive. Meetings grew longer. Approvals took extra steps. Decisions that once passed on trust now required confirmation. No one complained out loud, but everyone felt it. Efficiency slowed, not because of resistance, but because certainty had been replaced by verification. I recognized that cost immediately. It was the price of attention. One afternoon, a senior officer asked me a question that wasn't really a question. "Have you noticed the shift?" he said, eyes fixed on a screen that didn't require his attention. "Yes," I replied. He nodded once. "Good." That was the entire conversation. No reference to the transfer. No mention of the missing name. Just acknowledgement that something had changed and that it wasn't going to be undone. Later, I found myself rereading older records, not the ledger, but archived files that predated it. I saw now what I hadn't noticed before. Patterns. Repetition. The same gaps appearing in different places, always explained away, always smoothed over. The man hadn't created a problem. He'd exposed an old one. That realization came with weight. Because now I knew the absence on the list wasn't unique. It was simply the first one that had been designed to survive its own removal. I thought about reaching out, about warning someone, escalating, formalizing what I'd learned. But formalization would have undone everything. The truth didn't need to be shouted. It needed to be impossible to ignore. So I did what the plan required. Nothing. Days turned into weeks. The pressure eased, but the awareness remained. The system adjusted again, slowly finding a new equilibrium that allowed it to function without pretending nothing had happened. That's how large structures heal. Not by repair. By accommodation. One evening, as I logged off for the night, I caught my reflection in the darkened screen. I looked the same as always. No mark. No visible change. But I knew better. I wasn't just carrying the ledger. I was carrying the understanding that once you see how easily people can be removed from record, you can never fully trust what's written again. That's the real cost. Not fear. Not guilt. Clarity. And clarity is heavy. As I stepped outside, the air was still. No alarms. No alerts. Just a quiet compound doing its work. The kind of quiet that suggests stability. But now I could tell the difference. This wasn't ignorance. It was vigilance. And vigilance, once learned, doesn't fade. It waits. For the next name that doesn't appear where it should. The story didn't end with closure. It rarely does. There was no final report, no internal memo acknowledging a correction had been made. Systems don't admit to learning. They just behave differently afterward. I noticed it in the margins. Transfers delayed for reasons that didn't need explanation. Clearances tightened just enough to make shortcuts inconvenient. Questions asked earlier in the process, when answers could still change outcomes instead of just documenting them. The system hadn't confessed. It had adapted. I never saw the man again. I didn't expect to. Plans like his aren't designed for reunions. They're designed to remove dependence on outcomes you can't control. But his influence lingered. A training update circulated quietly, emphasizing record integrity and traceability. No reference to past failures. No implication of wrongdoing. Just a reminder that absence creates risk. I read it carefully. It was the closest thing to acknowledgement I'd ever see. The ledger stayed untouched. Not because it wasn't useful, but because it had already done what it needed to do. Its value wasn't in what it said. It was in what it forced others to notice. One evening, as I prepared to shut down for the day, a junior analyst stopped by my desk. He hesitated, then spoke. "Sir," he said, "have you ever seen a file that was too clean?" I looked at him for a long moment. "Yes," I said. "And when you do?" He nodded slowly. "You read it twice." "3 times," I replied. He smiled, unsure why. That was when I understood the final layer of the plan. It wasn't about protecting a truth forever. It was about teaching the system how to recognize when it was being used to erase one. The man had walked away with his life intact, but he'd left something behind that couldn't be escorted out or transferred off-site. Suspicion. Not paranoia. Not distrust. Awareness. That's the kind of remainder that doesn't show up in ledgers or lists, but it reshapes behavior over time. As I left the compound that night, the lights dimmed behind me in their usual pattern. Predictable. Comforting. But now, when I looked at them, I didn't see reassurance. I saw effort. Effort being spent to make sure the system didn't look away again. The list was still incomplete. It always would be. But now, every absence mattered. Every blank field demanded attention. And that was enough. Because the most effective legacy isn't proof. It's habit. And habits, once formed, outlast the people who started them. The man wasn't on the list. But because of him, the list would never be trusted blindly again. That was what remained. And it was exactly what he'd intended. I never added his name to anything. No record. No annotation. No hidden field waiting to be discovered later. The system didn't need another entry. It needed to remember that absence could be deliberate. That was the account he left behind. Time moved on. Assignments changed. Faces rotated through positions the way they always do. If you looked at the surface, nothing about the organization appeared different. It still moved with confidence. It still spoke in certainty. But underneath, something had shifted. People hesitated where they hadn't before. Questions were asked earlier. Files were opened twice. Not because of fear. Because of awareness. I carried the ledger for a long time without ever touching it again. Eventually, it became unnecessary. Not because it lost relevance, but because its purpose had been fulfilled. The truth it contained no longer needed a physical anchor. It had entered behavior. That's the part most people misunderstand about plans like his. They assume the goal is exposure. Revelation. A moment when everything comes into the light. It isn't. The goal is to change how decisions are made when no one is watching. He didn't want justice in the open. He wanted caution in the dark. I think about him sometimes, not where he went, but when he decided to leave. The patience it must have taken to build a plan that depended on restraint instead of action, on silence instead of force. That kind of thinking doesn't come from anger. It comes from understanding how systems protect themselves. And how they can be taught to do better without being broken. If I had followed the order without question, nothing would have changed. The list would have remained clean. The absence would have been absorbed. Another correction buried beneath procedure. Instead, one transfer became a mirror. Not dramatic enough to cause panic. Not obvious enough to demand response. Just clear enough to linger. That's the difference between disruption and correction. Disruption demands reaction. Correction creates habit. The man was never meant to be found. He was meant to be believed. Not in his innocence or guilt, but in the fact that the system could be used to erase someone if no one paid attention. Now, people pay attention. And that's the real ending. No arrest. No confession. No headline. Just a quieter world where blank fields are noticed, and silence is questioned before it becomes permission. The list remains incomplete. It always will. But now, every name that isn't there carries weight. And that's the account I keep, not of what happened, but of what didn't. Because sometimes the most important stories are the ones that end without proof. And leave behind something far more difficult to remove. Hidden Chapters is about the choices. No one asks you to explain. Like the video and subscribe. If you want to hear the next story. And if this decision were yours. Would you step in, or look away?